Assalamu alaikum and welcome to our 59th webinar hosted at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. The webinar is designed to introduce cutting edge and latest work in the field of international relations and Islamic studies. Today we have a very esteemed guest joining us from North Carolina, my own home state. So I am very excited to host him. Today's seminar will be on Islam's role in Indonesia's fight against colonialism. Today we have Dr. Kevin Fogg, who is a scholar of Islam in Southeast Asia and is the Associate Director of the Carolina Asia Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has previously taught in a number of history faculties, including the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. He is on a number of boards for journals, academic journals, including the Malay World, Hunafa, and Alumna. The talk today is based on his recent book from 2019 called the Indonesian Islam in the Islamic Indonesian Revolution, if I got that right. And I will begin first by allowing Dr. Fogg to introduce his work, his research, and give us a general idea of the role of Islam in Indonesia's revolution. It is a underrepresented topic in modern history, both in the Muslim world and in the Western Academy. And so we are excited to have him introduce us to this topic as a part of our ongoing investigation into the role of Islam in modern history, and especially in revolutions around the Muslim world. So, Dr. Fogg, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Han, to Professor Al-Arian, to Professor Akhtanis, and all of our colleagues over at CIGA. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak to you. Dengan nama Tuhan yang Maha Pengasih Maha Pengampun, in the name of the Lord, the Merciful and the Gracious. Greetings from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and from the Carolina Asia Center. And before we get rolling, I also want to express my condolences and my solidarity with the people of Turkey who have faced such a difficult tragedy over the last month. I know that we here in North Carolina are doing our best to find ways to support Turkey as you face this difficulty. I've been asked today to speak a little bit on the role of Islam in Indonesia's struggle against colonialism. And so I'm going to try and tackle this in a holistic way, thinking about 150 years worth of the role of Islam. And we'll wrap that up in the recent book that I published about 2-3 years ago on the role of Islam in Indonesia's revolution specifically. When I think of a time period or a periodization for the struggle against colonialism in Indonesia, the first phase is going to be early resistance, right? As the Dutch, but in a couple of parts of the archipelago, other colonial forces, the Portuguese, the British were also present. As those European colonial powers tried to establish control, there was early resistance against them. And Islam certainly played a role in that early resistance. So we'll talk through that a little bit. And then think about how that was fundamentally different from the role that Islam played in what in Indonesia is identified as the nationalist era. This begins around 1910. Some folks would put it a little bit forward to 1908. Some folks would put it a little bit back to 1912 or 1915. But that's the period when Indonesians across hundreds of different ethnicities, across thousands of different islands, began to think of themselves as belonging together, that they were going to struggle against European colonialism together, and began to think of the future that they would have as being one nation. And there's much debate about the role of Islam in that nation and the role of Islam in the struggle to create that nation. The final stage in the struggle against colonialism in Indonesia was the Indonesian Revolution. That began right after the Japanese surrender in 1945 at the end of World War II. and continued through the Dutch transfer of sovereignty to Indonesia in 1949. Now, the historiography agrees, both that written in English and what's written in the Indonesian language, Bahasa Indonesia, agrees to call this thing the revolution because it was a revolution for independence, like the American Revolution. Some would argue like revolutions elsewhere, and we might unpack that a little bit in the question and answer. Islam had a very particular role in the Indonesian Revolution. That's what I've written my recent book on. And so that's what I hope we'll unpack at the end. But let's start at the beginning, like any good historian should, and think about the role of Islam in early resistance against the Dutch. There were a number of wars to gradually implement colonial control over the islands that today make up the country of Indonesia. The islands with the largest population are first Java, which is a flat island along the southern side of the Indonesian archipelago, which has about 60% of the population. And then the second most populous is Sumatra, the island in the west. You may have heard of Aceh, where they had the 2004 tsunami. You may have seen Sumatran blend coffee at your local coffee shop. On both of those islands, there was a very strong role for Islam to serve as a rallying cry and a unifying force when they were engaged in wars to fight off the initial imposition of colonialism. One classic example of this is the Java War. And you see on this slide a painting of Diponegoro, a prince in central Java who was crucial in fighting against the imposition of Dutch control in the 1820s. He was engaged in a struggle between different factions of the local royal house over who would take control. He believed that he was the rightful heir. The Dutch were supporting someone else who wouldn't give them so much trouble, who would allow them to establish plantation economies and extract wealth from the archipelago. Diponegoro strongly resisted, and he used Islam as a way to gather forces unto himself. He used it as a force for his own spiritual strength, right? Inspiration for his struggle against the Dutch, who were seen as infidels, who were seen as kafir. The painting that we see was by an Indonesian artist pushing back against the Dutch narratives of Diponegoro submitting in the end. This is showing him actually being defiant. He was tricked by the Dutch, who asked him to come for negotiations. He thought he had the upper hand, that the negotiations would lead to their surrender. In fact, they ambushed him at the site of negotiations and sent him into exile on another island. But similar to the Java War, the colonial wars to establish Dutch colonial control on the island of Sumatra also had a strong role for Islam in the Indonesian resistance. The Padri War was initially a civil war in central Sumatra, or today's province of West Sumatra, in which a group of, forgive me for saying, very conservative Muslims who had been influenced by the initial occupation of the Hijaz by the Wahhabi movement in the early 19th century, they returned to their home district in central Sumatra, and they began to implement strong teachings about the unity of God. They began to outlaw practices that had up till then been very common among the Minangkabau ethnic people of that region, practices such as chewing betel, practices such as respecting women's ownership over land, given the matrilineal nature of the local ethnicity. As they did that, there erupted a civil war in Minangkabau heartlands between those who accepted the new interpretation of Islam and those who wanted to defend the old practices. And the Dutch inserted themselves into that civil war because one side of the civil war was very much basing its own ideological position on a strong interpretation of Islam, in fact, an interpretation of Islam that was quite new for the region along the lines of Wahhabism. This made the war immediately snap into a religious idiom. And so the local Muslims who were fighting against the Dutch understood this as an Islamic war, and their role to try and fight off Dutch colonialism was very much based in religion. They were not successful. The Dutch had superior firearms and were able to, over the course of about 15 years, put down the Padris and bring the Padri War to an end. Again, they exiled the leader, a man called Imam Bonjol. Bonjol was his hometown. He was an imam. He was a prayer leader. Exiled him to another island within the archipelago. The longest colonial war in Indonesia was the Aceh War on that northernmost tip of Sumatra. This lasted from the early 1870s until, right up until really 1911 was when they finally finished what the Dutch called a pacification campaign, trying to conquer the final territory in the archipelago. And again, the Acehnese very strongly relied on Islam. They had Muslim leaders, Islamic scholars, who were at the forefront of organizing troops and organizing guerrilla resistance against the imposition of Dutch colonial control. The thing about all of these instances, initial resistance against colonial imposition, is that although Islam was a very important rallying cry and served as a unifying force for the Achenese, for the Minangkabau, for the Javanese, the groups that we would later on call Indonesians, but of course this was before the idea of an Indonesian nation emerged, there wasn't an institutional role for Islam, right? It's not that mosques organized themselves to be centers of resistance. Although you had individual Muslim leaders, you didn't have all Muslim leaders siding with these resistance movements. You had a disorganized sort of Muslim community. And so while Islam could serve as a rallying cry, it wasn't able to mobilize resources in the same way that it would be when we reach the next era, the nationalist era in Indonesia. That transition happens around the time that the Dutch finish consolidating the territory across these thousands of islands that make up the Indonesian archipelago. And you can actually see those islands in the image on the left here. This image is taken from a pamphlet, an advertisement for a religious organization, Islamic organization in the mid-20th century, trying to gather together youth to reform the country and push towards a more Islamic Indonesia. But you can see that he's firmly grounded on the Indonesian archipelago there. He has one foot on Sumatra, the other foot on Borneo, and then Java is the long island along the south. Sulawesi is the starfish-shaped island in Papua in the east, the islands that today make up the Indonesian archipelago. As the Dutch finished consolidating that territory into one very large colony and the most economically productive colony for the Dutch, and arguably the most economically productive colony for any European power in this era, you began to see modern organizations rise, organizations that had constitution and bylaws, organizations that had formal membership, where you would register yourself, you would get a membership card, sometimes you would be paying monthly fees or yearly fees to be a member of the organization. And those organizations played a very strong and important role in resisting Dutch colonialism and pushing for Indonesian self-determination, nationalism, independence, freedom. Some of those roles were explicitly political, right? And you had political organizations. The first, the largest, the most important was called Syarikat Islam. It grew out of a trade organization, actually, an organization that was trying to organize Muslim batik merchants, merchants of the local cloth that's dyed using batik techniques, who were worried about Chinese monopolization of their industry and wanted to make sure that Muslims had an opportunity to work with other locals, other non-Chinese indigenous peoples, especially initially on the island of Java, to market their wares and to gain the major profit from creating and selling these wares. That Syarikat Dagang Islam, the Islamic Merchants Association, evolved and grew into the Syarikat Islam at around 1911. Syarikat Islam was led in the 19-teens and into the 1920s by a very charismatic man named Haji Omar Said Cokraminoto, or HOS Cokraminoto. He was not actually very well educated in Islam. He didn't speak very good Arabic. He was not raised in a particularly pious family, but he understood Islam as being fundamental to his struggle, and he wrote a number of influential treatises that are still read in Indonesia today. One of the most famous and most popular is actually a treatise on Islam and socialism. But he was trying to find a new vision for what Islam might look like, pushing towards the independence of Indonesia, or at least the self-determination and the betterment of native peoples of the archipelago. And so trying to find that meeting point of Islam and modernity and to promote it through Syarikat Islam made the organization wildly popular across many islands, not just Central Java where it first rose, but onto Sumatra, onto Indonesian Borneo, onto Sulawesi, where Muslim populations joined this in very large numbers. And Syarikat Islam, for a while in the 19-teens, when its membership skyrocketed up to 2 million, by 1918, just 7 years after its formal founding. This functioned largely as a self-help organization, as an advocacy organization for the interests of native Muslim peoples of the archipelago. And it was seen by the Dutch as the greatest threat, the greatest sort of nationalist threat to their control. Because of this, the Dutch did their best to break up Syarikat Islam, not entirely banning it, but weakening its solidarity and its ability to organize. One of the things that they did in that nature was they said, you can't have a centrally organized Syarikat Islam across the whole archipelago. you have to have local branches as the highest chapters. So although they would have conferences that brought together the local branches, they couldn't have one singular national leadership after 1918. Sarakat Islam was also weakened by the early 1920s because it was infiltrated by communist groups. They created what was known as the red Sarakat Islam versus a white Sarakat Islam, white being not only the second color of Indonesian nationalism. You might know the Indonesian flag today is red over white, but also white was associated with the robes of returning Hajis, right? Those who had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, who would come back wearing a white turban or white robes. And so white Sarakat Islam was seen as the pious one. That division within the body of Sarakat Islam and the lack of the ability to centrally organize meant that although it was a very popular political organization in the 1910s, Sarakat Islam was much weakened by the 1920s. At the same time, you saw the emergence of non-political organizations that became very influential in society, very influential, especially in religion. And several of these have remained influential into the current day. So organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia, most folks would recognize it as the largest formal Islamic organization in the world. Muhammadiyah is the #2 organization in Indonesia, founded a little bit earlier. This one is modernist or reformist. It doesn't follow one of the 4 Sunni schools of jurisprudence. Instead, it's returning directly to the scriptures, to the Quran and the Sunnah, to derive fresh interpretations. And they believe that the Bab al-Ijtihad, the door of interpretation, is opened again, inspired by Rashiduddin and Muhammad Abduh. Nahdlatul Ulama, which was founded a little bit later, was in many ways a reaction to Muhammadiyah, trying to defend the traditional understanding, which was within the Shafi'i school of jurisprudence. Other organizations such as Jamiat al-Washliyah that created the poster you see on your screen, or Al-Irshad, which was an organization of ethnic Arabs who had migrated to the archipelago, most of them Hadramis. There were organizations like Sumatra Tawalib, right? So the students of Sumatra. All of these were advocating for a greater influence of Islam in life, although not necessarily in politics or government. They recognized the role of the Dutch colonial government. All of these were advocating for a new reinvigoration of Islamic education, and many of them were based off of local schools, building off of the networks of local Islamic teachers. A lot of these were advocating for the rights to teach Islam as they wanted. They didn't want any Dutch colonial meddling in their affairs. And in that way, they were resisting Dutch colonialism in one of the most visible ways in Indonesia in the 1920s and 1930s. The Sumatra Tawalib, for example, organized several large parades, strikes, demonstrations against Dutch efforts to require the certification of any teachers in Islamic schools to prove that they wouldn't be teaching against Dutch colonialism, which of course many of them were. In addition to the role of Islamic organizations, both political and non-political, as direct resistors to Dutch colonialism and participants in the struggle against colonialism in Indonesia, it's also really important to recognize the influence that Islamic anti-colonial forces in Indonesia had on secular and non-Islamic nationalists in the country. I mentioned earlier that Sarakat Islam actually gave birth to the Indonesian Communist Party, that it was infiltrated by the communists that created the red Sarakat Islam. That went on to found the Indonesian Communist Party in 1921. But additionally, especially figures like Haji Omar Said Cokroaminoto, the great leader of Sarakat Islam, was a father morally or sort of politically to a number of the leaders of Indonesian secular nationalism who became so important after independence. Cokroaminoto in his house in Surabaya was host for several years to many of the young student leaders who would go on to become crucially important in the 1930s and then after independence. The one that you might have heard of is Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia. Sukarno actually lived with Cokroaminoto for several years, and Sukarno's first wife was Cokroaminoto's daughter, although that marriage probably was not consummated, and Sukarno did not stay with her for very long. She may or may not have been able, fully equipped to understand the marriage herself. Cokroaminoto also hosted leaders in what later became major Islamic movements. A leader in West Java called Kartosuwiryo, who later led an Islamic rebellion in the 1940s and 50s. Cokroaminoto was a mentor to many of the publishers in the future Indonesian independent press. And so the way that Sadakat Islam, as a pioneer, both in organizing natives to advocate for their own self-interest, and the personal touch that Chokro Aminoto had in mentoring a number of the future leaders in secular, communist, and non-Islamic groups, mean that the role of Islam was not just in its own organizations, but it was in forging a way for other national organizations to resist the Dutch. As Indonesia moved on through the early decades of the 20th century, the nationalist movement became much stronger. It became more widespread. It was not limited just to student organizers, but it became more popular among individuals in their 20s and 30s and older. And the Dutch began to give a little bit of room for Indonesian participation in government, certainly participation at the low level as clerks, as assistants, district attorneys, all of these roles. But also they created a representative body that was really just a show. It was a Potemkin village, not a true organization with power. But they did allow for Indonesian members of that representative body. That included some Islamic or Islamically inclined representatives, and included a lot of secular nationalists who might be Muslim in their own private lives, but didn't bring Islam into their politics. All of that, of course, changed rapidly in 1941 and 1942. When the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia, they were able to overthrow the Dutch quite rapidly. And between 1942 and 1945, Indonesia was occupied by the Japanese Empire throughout World War II. Japanese were not particularly kind. Their colonial occupation was in some ways more bitter than that of the Dutch because they were entirely on a wartime footing. It was, always extracting as much as they could and trying to get Indonesians to participate in the war machine of the Japanese. Quite a lot of suffering due to lack of food, lack of resources, because they were cut off from the rest of the world and forced into a system of autarky. But at the end of the Second World War, as soon as the Japanese surrendered, the Indonesians, led by two individuals, Sukarno and his colleague Muhammad Hatta, representing a triumvirate of Javanese and Sumatran leaders, proclaimed Indonesian independence on August 17th, 1945. And that's what inaugurated the period of the Indonesian Revolution. When the Indonesians proclaimed their independence and said, we are now our own nation, all of the peoples of Indonesia are going to determine our own future, we are working together, we will use the Indonesian language, which is not of one ethnicity, but is a pan-ethnic second language for everyone. This was not accepted by the Dutch. The Dutch said, at the end of the war, everything goes back to the status quo ante. We will resume our control over the Indonesian archipelago and once again take you in as part of the Dutch crown territories. And so there followed 4 years of sporadic fighting, but intense fighting in the Indonesian archipelago to try to determine the future of this place. Would it become a Dutch colony again? Would it become fully independent? Would it become a dependency with some rights of self-determination? How would this move forward? Would it become independent entirely as one, collectively? Or would it be split into different states? Not all of Indonesia is majority Muslim. In Eastern Indonesia in particular, there are a large number of Hindus, Catholics, Protestants. At that time, there were a lot of followers of traditional native religions. And so would they all join together with the Javanese, the Sumatrans, the Borneans, or would they become separate states in different parts of the archipelago? That conflict is known today as the Indonesian Revolution. And I think one of the reasons why I was invited to join this webinar for CIGA was to talk about my recent book that's looking at that revolution with what I hope are fresh eyes. The Indonesian Revolution, in the historiography by Indonesians themselves, by Americans, some of whom were actually in the archipelago at the end of World War II and observing this directly. The founder of the field of Southeast Asian studies in the United States was in Yogyakarta, which was the revolutionary capital of Indonesia, watching all of this happen. Even the historiography by the Dutch and other European scholars has not recognized a role for religion in this fight, right? The people who came out at the end of the revolution were secularists. The people who negotiated with the Dutch at the negotiation table before the United Nations, this was the first instance when the United Nations became involved in a case of national self-determination, those guys are secularists. And so the role of very pious Muslims who thought that Islam should take a role in the independent state, in the form, the structure of the state, the role of Islamic politicians and Islamic political parties in the Indonesian Revolution has not been unpacked as much as I think it should. So my book, published in 2020 on Indonesia's Islamic Revolution, tries to tackle that in two levels. And then I'm going to add a third just because of the interests of CIGA to think about international relations. So the first level at which I think we need to examine the role of Islam in Indonesia's revolution is at that grassroots level, right? The fighting that happened on the ground, the experience of people in the villages, the vast majority of Indonesians who were trying to resist Dutch colonialism, who were based in their village, who didn't have great communication connections to other places. How did they understand the role of Islam? And my argument, and I hope it's well sustained from documents at that time, archival records, some archival records captured by the Dutch, but also by hundreds of oral history interviews that I conducted with veterans of the war from across the archipelago, is that there were specific organizations, specific leaders, many groups in a lot of areas, the most prominent, the most powerful, the most influential groups, who fought for independence because they believed that it was a religious mandate. They believed that God wanted them to engage in the struggle. They understood the struggle as a holy war. In Indonesian, this is called Perang Sabil. The Sabil, of course, comes from the Arabic phrase Sabilillah. So Perang is Indonesian for war. And this was also called in Arabic a jihad fi sabilillah, right? Same terms. They believed that this was a war that was blessed by God and that those who fought were doing God's will to push towards the independence of Indonesia. And so the way that they conducted that war reflected that understanding, right? They would refuse to surrender. They would treat any who died as martyrs, shahid. They would engage in special prayers to try and promote their success. One of the chapters in this book that I find has gotten the strongest reactions, the most interesting reactions, is that many of the Indonesians at this time were engaged in what they understood as Islamic magic, the use of amulets or jimat, the use of incantations, the use of special blessings that were all understood in Islamic idioms, right? These were, using Quranic verses. These were done by Islamic leaders at the local level. But this was also intended to protect and to strengthen the fighting forces on the ground. It's important to understand that grassroots understanding of Islam as central to the fight, because that colored how a lot of Indonesians at that grassroots level, at that village level, thought about the state that they were trying to get in the 1950s, once Indonesia's independence had been achieved. Many of them believed that they would be getting an Islamic state. They believed that the state should be founded on the basis of Islam, that the state might need to require Islamic compliance with Islamic law for Muslim citizens of the state. When those things were not achieved in the 1950s, it helps us to understand why there were a large number of Islamic groups that went into rebellion against the Indonesian state, the state that they had just fought for. They went into rebellion against it in the 1950s in a number of different ways. The Darul Islam rebellion of West Java, of Aceh, of Central Kalimantan, of South Sulawesi, but also the PRRI rebellion of West Sumatra in 1958. Those only make sense if we understand that the grassroots had an Islamic understanding of what was happening. There's also a prominent role for Islamic groups and Islamic individuals in the political and diplomatic struggle for Indonesia's independence, in the halls of power, such as they were. Maybe I should say the pendopos, the outside pagodas of power, where Indonesian political leaders were meeting in Jakarta, and then after they had to flee in the revolutionary capital of Yogyakarta. There were Muslims at the highest echelons of government. One of the most revolutionary things that happened in this era is that the wartime circumstances, where Indonesia was being led by socialist prime ministers, where Indonesia was being led by those who did not collaborate with the Japanese during the brief occupation. So the prime ministers after November of 1945 really needed to be non-collaborators. Those individuals promoted, handpicked, worked closely with a new class of Islamic, political leaders that had not been prominent before the war. And that changed the nature of Islamic politics in Indonesia and pushed Indonesian Islam more towards the type of textual, internationally recognized Islam and away from some of the local practices that today might be called syncretic, but local practices that depended on understandings of the religion that are not merely encapsulated in the Quran and the Sunnah, but are also built on traditions that had accrued over hundreds of years. I want to say a couple of words about the role of the international Muslim community in supporting Indonesian independence. And this is especially important when we remember that Indonesia was the first case of national self-determination that was adjudicated by the new United Nations organization. Indonesia really wanted to go to the negotiation table early. This was less popular at the grassroots level, where they didn't understand that. They wanted to fight for their 100% independence because they believed that that's what God wanted them to do, and they thought that God was on their side. The high-level politicians said, we really need to get to the negotiation table. We've just finished one war. Nobody wants another war. Let's get this to the negotiation table. And as they did that, they recognized that the United Nations was the likeliest forum, right? They couldn't go to the Dutch. The Dutch didn't want to negotiate. The Dutch wanted to fight. The Dutch had superior arms. They thought they would win in the battlefield. But by going to the United Nations, they had a real chance. The problem was getting this onto the agenda of the United Nations to convince the United Nations that this was not an internal Dutch issue. And when the Security Council at the UN was made up of countries like the United States, like Britain, like France, all of which had their own colonies. Remember, the United States was still involved in the Philippines through 1946 as a direct colonizer. That was a hard sell, right? To say that the United Nations should interfere in the relationship between a colony and a metropole. What was a great advantage for Indonesia is that early in 1947, you began to see other Muslim countries, especially Arab countries in the Middle East, formally recognize the independence of Indonesia. And that allowed third countries like India and like Australia to then elevate the Indonesian case to the UN Security Council. Because this was a country, it was recognized by other members of the United Nations and therefore could be adjudicated. Do they count as a country or not? Could they be admitted? And how should we solve this time of violence in Indonesia? The first country to recognize Indonesian independence was Egypt in March of 1947. And thereafter swiftly followed a number of Middle Eastern countries, Arab-speaking countries, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Lebanon, Jordan followed in 1947, I believe. And the recognition that those countries afforded to Indonesia was crucial to the case being tabled both by India and Australia. But that recognition was actually premised on the idea of Muslim brotherhood. The leader of the Arab League, Abdurrahman Azam, or Azam Pasha, was very strongly in favor of recognizing Indonesia, advocated sort of endlessly for Indonesia's independence in the Arab League itself. And his vision for this was a pan-Islamic vision. He wasn't just a pan-Arabist. He also had a very strong Islamic flavor to that pan-Arabism. And so it's helpful to understand the foundations of Indonesia's international recognition as also relying on Islamic solidarity within the Muslim community of states. Before I conclude and turn it over to y'all's question and answer, I do want to point out that although Islam had a very strong role in each of these three eras, right? The initial resistance, the nationalist era, and in the revolution where Indonesia actually fought for its independence, Islam was one of several elements in each of those periods. Islam was not the only thing that had a role in resistance against colonialism. So I would point, of course, to secular nationalism, and that's the force that eventually came to power in Indonesia after the transfer of sovereignty in 1949. There were also, very understandably, racial and ethnic sentiments. There was certainly racial dislike of having a foreign or a white, at times a Japanese ruler over Indonesia. But some of the initial movements against the Dutch rulers were explicitly ethnic and not religious, right? Indonesia today dates the beginning, the formal government education curriculum, dates the beginning of national resistance against the Dutch to 1908, which was the formation of an ethnic society of Javanese who wanted to assert their Javanese identity, not a Muslim identity, not a pan-Indonesian identity, but just their Javanese local ethnic identity as a way to resist Dutch colonialism. You had various types of leftism, both socialism and communism, that were very important in the revolution, having their own strain of resistance, that were very important in the nationalist era. There were also a number of very interesting combinations between these, right? Combinations between secular nationalism and Islam, combinations between ethnic or racial identity and Islam, certainly in the early resistance period, even combinations between leftism and Islam that were exploring new ideas in the 1920s, 30s, and even into the 40s and 50s, into the early decades of Indonesian independence. With that, I'm going to put up a slide so any of you who are watching might be able to reach out to me if you have further questions after this webinar. I'm delighted to answer you via email, or you can see more of my work at kevinwfogg.net, or you can download some of my articles and other writings at academia.edu. And I hope those links are useful to you. Let me conclude my initial comments by just saying, terima kasih sebanyak-banyaknya, thank you very much. And let me hand it back to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fogg. You wonderfully gave us the appropriate background and even some fine-grained details about the role of Islam in Indonesia, along with its historiographical challenges. I want to mention that, it's very surprising for Muslims in general that, that many times we don't comprehend how big Indonesia really is. I mean, Indonesia is, although it's in Southeast Asia, its landmass, I think, stretches as large as the continental United States. And the population of Indonesia is also one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, or if not the largest Muslim population in the Muslim world. And oftentimes, when we think about the role of Islam in politics, the case of Indonesia just falls on the margins. And it's very important for our students and staff to really get a grip on how these conversations against colonialism have this kind of global history, right? About how they are situated within a larger colonial context. And a lot of the debates that were of importance to anti-colonial actors in what you might call the heartland were also, or even not even more interestingly and more creatively adjudicated in Indonesia. So I really wanted to thank you for your brilliant presentation. I have a number of questions. Also, we have questions coming in from our YouTube channel and the viewers. So I'll be fielding those to you as we move along. But before I begin, I'd like to defer to Dr. Sami, who is the director of CIGA, to give his initial comments and questions. And then I will proceed by fielding you questions that I get from our participants. Thank you very much. Dr. Sami?
Thank you very much, Owais, for your kind words. And thank you so much, Dr. Kevin Fogg, for your presentation, actually, and for bringing this topic to our audience and to us. When it comes to the concept of an Islamic revolution, particularly in the past half century or so, most intellectuals, most academics, particularly in this part of the world, in the Muslim world, they think of an Iranian experience, the Iranian revolution, particularly since this is something that is of more recent memory, and it was successful because it was termed as an Islamic revolution. And of course, there is so much literature about it. And the word revolution has taken also a different meaning than just simply a national liberation struggle. Within the context of the nation state, most movements for independence would be called national liberation struggles. And then they could take, or Islam could play a role, but not necessarily the central role. I mean, it has played role in the revolution, in the Algerian national liberation struggle, which is also called revolution as well, and in many other instances in the fights against colonial powers. The case of Indonesia really, as the way you presented it, brings another light to this argument, or another aspect that was not pursued. And I would like to hear more, and then I have a lot of follow-up questions. How would you compare that national liberation struggle or the role of Islam in the independent movement, in the independence movement? And how do we compare it to the Iranian Revolution? Granted that the Iranian Revolution were against a dictator, supported by the West, where Western interest was front and center in having the Shah in power and in supporting him by different means. But also the role of the ulama, the role of the clerics. It wasn't just a religious or spiritual role, but also it was a political role, particularly after the success of the Iranian Revolution and the adoption of an Islamic constitution. You mentioned in your introduction to the book that, or even now, you mentioned that this was like one day event or something, you know, where Islam was suggested to have a central role in the governance, but somehow it got dissipated, got dismissed, it got rejected. I would like to know a little bit more about that. Why did Islam play a major or central role, but yet they couldn't even impact what happened afterwards? You talk in your book about actually it has two parts, one about the revolution side or the revolution era and the political side. And were they totally divorced? Does that mean that the people who were involved in the revolution from an Islamic point of view were totally devoid of any political experience or political savviness by which they could make a difference or an impact in the aftermath of the success of that revolution? So all these thoughts I have, and I'm sure I have follow-up. So let's start here and take it from there.
Thank you. So many wonderful and juicy questions to unpack there. So I'm going to start off with revolution and then build into Iran and then talk about the Indonesian case, yeah? You were right that revolution has sort of two different meanings in the popular lexicon. And I think I'm using this in the second of the meanings, right? So revolution can be that internal upheaval and change within a single society, such as the French Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. There is some of that in Indonesia, but that's not the primary meaning in Indonesia. The other is that national liberation struggle. So the American Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, you mentioned the Algerian Revolution, the Filipino Revolution. Indonesia is unambiguously one of these cases where they're throwing out a foreign ruler and implementing their own government. Within that kind of national liberation struggle, you are also, by necessity, setting up a new type of government and changing the orientation, changing the ideology of how the state will run. And so, although it is not necessarily so thoroughgoing or so, it's not disruptive in the same way as an internal revolution like the Chinese or the French or the Iranian, it has within it the fundamental seeds or the structural requirements to do some of those structural changes. When I think about the comparison with Iran, I'm, yes, absolutely interested in what the comparison is for 1979. I want to build back, as a historian, I want to build back and think not just about the 1979 revolution in Iran, but maybe a better fit is the constitutional revolution in Iran, 1906 to 1911, right? In which Muslim clerics, right? I'm not going to try to name them because my Persian is so poor that I'm going to butcher some of these names. But several Muslim clerics were very prominent ever since the Tobacco Revolt in leading popular movements. They were legislators, they were thought leaders, they were social leaders in society, and they participated in the constitutional revolution. And yet that constitutional revolution in Iran did not establish a government whose primary aim was a religious aim in the way that the 1979 revolution did. So if you want a very close analogy between Indonesia and Iran, you might find the constitutional revolution to be a more interesting parallel and one worth thinking through. Now, to turn to the 1979 revolution in Iran, and you're right that is the Islamic revolution par excellence, and it's what people think of normatively in terms of an Islamic revolution. I have a fantastic colleague here at UNC called Charlie Kurzman, whose work on the 1979 revolution has been useful in my thinking, right? That the 1979 revolution, when it erupted, was a wide array of forces, all of whom, forgive me for saying it bluntly, despised the Shah, all of whom resented the dictatorship that he had imposed and the Western backing that he had and the abuses of human rights and the secret police and all of these things. And it was not guaranteed. It was not, in human terms, I'm not going to make any religious evaluation of what had been decreed by the divine, but it was not clear to all actors at the beginning of the 1979 revolution that it would be the Ayatollah and it would be the Islamic forces that would come out so unambiguously at the top of this revolution at the end. And there were possibilities for other ways that the 1979 revolution could have gone. It might have looked more like the constitutional revolution of 1906 to 1911, where Islam had a large role but didn't become the overwhelming, oppressively dominating force. In that way, the Indonesian revolution has similar elements, right? In 1945, a lot of people across Indonesia really wanted independence. And within the 4 years of the Indonesian revolution, you had a number of groups that actually declared a new revolution within the Indonesian revolution. So in 1947, you had both in West Java, a very pious Muslim named Kartosuwiryo, who declared the Indonesian Islamic State, Negara Islam Indonesia, as a full completion of the mission of August of 1945, like we're going to keep struggling. That later was taken as a rebellion against the Indonesian state and wasn't finally put down until the 1960s. In March of 1947, in East Java, in Madiun, you had a bunch of communist activists, many of whom had just returned from overseas, some of whom had spent World War II in the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe, who came and said, oh, we're going to proclaim a communist revolution. We're going to proclaim a communist state as the full fulfillment of that proclamation of independence from 1945. And these were all possible directions, right? It was entirely possible the Indonesian revolution could have gone in those other directions politically. And the resulting states in 1949, 1950 that came out of the revolution could have had an Islamic flavor or a communist flavor or some other structure. But that's not what happened, in part because of just the contingencies of the people who were on the ground, who happened to be well equipped, who happened to have the army on their side, and some of those things. Very specifically about the question of the way that Islam was written into the constitution that was promulgated on the 18th of August, 1945, the day after the Proclamation of Independence. This is something that Muslims have debated and in many ways regretted for 7 decades now, almost 8 decades. That when they proclaimed the Indonesian independence, that Muslims believed that they would have a more clear role for Islam in that constitution, that there would be a requirement in the constitution for Muslims to follow the Sharia as determined by the state, that there would be a requirement in the constitution for the president to be a Muslim. And the primary reason it seems that those were not included is because many Indonesian leaders in the very small group, handpicked by the Japanese, who were promulgating that constitution, were worried that such clauses in the constitution would lead to the breakup of the former Dutch territory, that Eastern Indonesia that did not have a Muslim majority would not choose to join a state that had a special role for Islam.
East Timor.
Not East Timor, but Eastern Indonesia. So the island of Bali, parts of the island of Sulawesi, the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and the Lesser Sundas, which is Lombok, Sumbawa, Timor, Flores, right? These have Hindu, Catholic, Protestant majorities, and that they might not be inclined to join a state, and that their participation was not guaranteed. Indonesia wanted to become fully independent with the entirety of the territory that had been controlled by the Dutch. And one of the ways that they worked to secure the full and enthusiastic participation of all those areas was to not include racial, ethnic, or religious elements in the Constitution as it was promulgated. But it was a very near miss. I mean, it could easily have gone in, and just, by virtue of the people they chose to consult with right before promulgation, it didn't go in. And that's something that I outline in one of the chapters of my book.
Just as a follow-up, because I'm trying also to understand the background and how it impacts today's politics. As you know, with the fall of the caliphate in the early 20th century, there was, the start of the of movements across the Muslim world of what is termed today as political Islam or Islamic movements, who are trying to re-establish an Islamic political order. How is it in Indonesia? How was it historically speaking? And how is it during the revolution? And how is it now? Do you see any sort of progress or regress, since people now talk about post-political Islam and others see it differently? How do you see it in the case of Indonesia?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that, as Dr. Han mentioned, I would love to get better attention to Indonesia when we're thinking about the comparative study of political Islam or Islam and the state. As Indonesia came into independence, it had very significant Muslim movements, some of which predated the revolution, some of which were born with the revolution as political parties. And Indonesia's first national election in 1955, Islamic parties won about 45% of the vote. This was not a majority. They were not able to implement their Islamic vision for the country. And that 45% was split across several parties. Masyumi was the biggest with 20% of the vote, 20.5%. Nahdlatul Ulama, which had been founded as a non-political organization, switched into a political party in the 1950s, had about 18%. And then like Sarakat Islam had become its separate political party. They had about 5%. There were a number of smaller groups. Political Islam trying to struggle in the 1950s to get Islam written into the state, written into the constitution. And they were drafting a new constitution based on an elected constitutional assembly. Just could not convince the others, right? I mean, that was the main cleavage line in Indonesian politics in the 50s. Did you want Islam as the basis of state or no? And when they failed to convince others and failed to pass this, it was a bit of a winter for political Islam in Indonesia from about 1960 until about 1990.
Is that because of the role of the military or other factors?
It preceded the military coup of 1965. It was partly because the Muslims were also the primary proponents of free and open democracy in Indonesia. And as Sukarno himself became more authoritarian in the 1960s, he was not very open to their criticism, and many of them went into rebellion. There are a number of factors that contribute to the decline of political Islam in Indonesia. But it was so much on the outs that, the famous Indonesian Islamic thinker Nurcholish Majid in 1970 proclaimed very, very popularly, to great applause at a major conference, he proclaimed, "Islam, yes, Islamic Party, no." And this was really the stance of a lot of Indonesians in the 1970s and into the 1980s. Was they loved Islam. They wanted to promote Islam. They wanted to teach Islam. They wanted to be good Muslims. But they didn't think that trying to form an Islamic political party was for the good of Islam or for the good of politics. They thought that you could do these in separate spheres. He called for secularism, right? Keeping the state out of religion, but not secularization, right? Not making our lives without religion. In part, in response to the rise of new types of Islamic movements in the 1980s, in response to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, in part in response to more and more people moving to cities and joining new types of Islamic movements, in part because Suharto, who was the military dictator of Indonesia from the 1960s through the 1990s, he was very weak on his development and wanted to find a new basis for his popularity, so he tried to co-opt Islamic groups. Islam came back into politics in the 1990s. And when Indonesia overthrew the dictatorship in 1998, shortly after the Asian financial crisis, once again, Islamic popular organizations, Islamic political parties, had a key role in that overthrow of the dictator through a popular movement, protests in May of 1998. And in fact, it was an Islamic cleric who became Indonesia's first elected president after that overthrow. Abdurrahman Wahid, popularly called Gus Dur, but Abdurrahman Wahid. And since 1999, since we began to have elections in what's called the Reformasi or Reformation era in Indonesia, Islamically based political parties have fluctuated between about 25 and about 35% of the popular vote. So never near the 1955 totals of 45% of the vote, but still, very solid. The Islamic bloc is solid at about a third of the country. One of the interesting trends since about 2010 specifically is that even those parties that are not based on Islam have tried very, very hard to get close to Islam so that Islam can't be used against them. So former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono founded his own party to be a political vehicle when he ran for president in 2006. And he was sort of campaigning on religious nationalism. Now, he didn't say which religion it was, but he said, nationalism religious, right? Both of these pulled from the English language words, English language cognates, rather than using Arabic or Austronesian cognates. But it was a very popular motto. When I travel around the archipelago, folks liked it, right? The idea that they could fully embrace their religion, but also fully embrace their nationalism. And in some ways that weakened the Islamically based parties, the explicitly Muslim parties. The current president, Joko Widodo, called Jokowi, when he was preparing to run for his second term, he knew that the best way to get himself back into the presidential palace was to bring on a large Islamic organization. So he took the sort of leading political cleric from Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest Islamic organization in the country, and made him his vice presidential candidate, Maruf Amin, who's our vice president in Indonesia today. So it's not that the potential of Islamic politics is capped at that 1/3 of the country, because also the non-Islamically based parties are trying to co-opt, trying to work with Islamic groups in their supposedly secular politics. This ebbs and flows. Indonesia's felt very much under threat in the last 5 or 6 years from very conservative organizations, some of which have now been outlawed, that are proposing a greater role for Islam in the state, and some of whom are allied with transnational movements, thinking about Islam and the state differently. We can go into that further if it's of interest.
Very good. I have another series of questions, and then I'll turn it over to Owais. This series of questions have to do with what I would call two types of understanding the force of Islam. On one hand, some people may see it basically as spiritual force, as a religion in the Western sense, where you need something to believe in and obviously to live by the moral code and ethical standards and all that. And I think your reference to some of the secular parties trying to adopt some of these things come from that sense. And the other understanding of Islam as a social force, perhaps against exploitation, tyranny, colonial hegemony, control, and so on and so forth, where it actually not only calls for the ethical and moral standards, but also as in terms of the realm of law and politics, international relations, and so on and so forth. This is what a lot of political movements that are based on Islam call for, in trying to reorient society towards more of a public Islamic order, rather than just in the private sphere. If these two notions, if we look at them, obviously, at least theoretically, as these two, where do you see first of all where would you put the revolution? Those who fought during that era, 45, 49, were they calling or hoping for an Islamic order, Islamic public order, or were they just inspired by Islam to get rid of a colonial power and trying to get a national state? That's question number one. Question number two has to do with today's political environment in Indonesia. Where do you see the struggle between these two forces? The force looking at Islam simply as a spiritual or religious in Western sense force, trying to be more conservative, more religious, more ethical, more spiritual, as opposed to those who would like to see Islam as a social order, a social and political order in society.
Yeah, two great questions. And I'll do my best. As you've noted, this is always a debate within Muslim societies themselves, right? So I don't take a position on it. I am not Muslim. I'm not going to weigh in on what
as a historian, as an observer.
Yes. But as a historian, as an expert on what people, I spend my time reading what Indonesians have said in the argument between these two poles. And so that's how I'll unpack this. I think the revolution was a high point, a high watermark for the movement, right? The social political order sense. One of the reasons why Islam functioned at the grassroots was because they said, this will give us the structure that we need that is not Dutch, but will organize our society, right? And so as I would go around and interview veterans of the war, those who lived through the revolutionary experience, they would say, well, we threw out all the Dutch rules and all of a sudden our village became organized around the Sharia. Now, what the Sharia means and how you implement it and what the role for women was a common dynamic that I thought was very interesting in Indonesia as opposed to some other Muslim societies. That could mean different things, but they understood this as a holistic social superstructure around which they could establish that new society, that post-colonial or non-colonial society. So I'd call the revolution a high watermark for the movement. I will say in the halls of power, you did have the other side presented. I mentioned the two proclamators of Indonesia's independence, Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta. Muhammad Hatta was a darn good Muslim. I mean, he was a very pious man. He did his prayers on time. He was so self-disciplined. He famously declared that he would take a vow of chastity until Indonesia became independent. So he didn't get married until well into his 40s because, he wanted Indonesia to become independent first. And then he was able to take a wife and have children. And when I've confirmed that actually directly with his daughters, right? This is a thing that I've been able to talk, straight to the family about. Muhammad Hatta was a very pious man, always observed the fast. I mean, he's really good, personally pious, but he did not want Islam to dictate the policies of the nation because he thought that this was in his private realm. He had been educated actually in the Netherlands, and he had more of that Western understanding of what a religion should be and how Islam would fit into the constraints of a personal or private religion, a moral force, rather than a social superstructure. Thinking about today, and I won't try and do all the decades in between, right? So we've got the moment of the revolution, thinking about Indonesia in the 2020s. This remains a debate. The current government of Indonesia would largely like for Islam to be a private religious commitment. They are perfectly willing to recognize certain boundaries that the government or society should not cross. And so Indonesia does have laws, for example, against the insulting of religions. I think that's how we would translate it. Penistaan agama is the Indonesian, causing dissension between religions. And in fact, in 2017, the then governor of Jakarta was actually brought down by a case in which he was accused of having insulted Islam, a very controversial and just flagrantly political issue in Indonesian public life. But this is one of the areas where the current government of Indonesia has been very cautious and concerned about smaller, sometimes more radical social groups that have been calling for the reorganization of society to reflect Islam as a social superstructure.
Is the Muhammadiyah movement part of this, or is it separate?
Muhammadiyah and NU are seen as the main line, as the sort of backbone of civil society in Indonesia. And while they would like for Islam to organize individuals' lives, they have not called for a restructuring of the state around Islamic lines. Muhammadiyah is a bit more conservative than NU on this, and Muhammadiyah in the last 12, 15 years has been more open to the role of Islam in the state. But the groups that are really pushing loudly and publicly are groups like Front Pembela Islam, the Islamic Defenders Front. Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia has actually been banned, but there are a number of organizations that are built on the followers of Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia that have come back out, and those are causing problems for the state, or the state has been antagonistic towards their vision for what the future of the Indonesian state should look like.
Just last thing, are there any influence from the Muslim Brotherhood in the Indonesian groups?
Yes. The nature of that influence is highly debated. Without taking a position on this scholarship, I will tell you what some of the scholarship is saying. It's stuff that I half believe and half I'm a little bit skeptical of, because there are, especially in the Western world, especially in America, there are folks who look for the Muslim Brotherhood under every rock and around every corner, right? And so I'm a little bit worried about that. But there has been a lot of discussion or comparison between what in Indonesia is called the Tarbiyah movement, the education movement, that began in the 1980s in Indonesia to create cells on university campuses, usually based at the university mosque, and to engage in a structure of establishing study groups that functioned like families, a home away from home. You went off to a big city for university, and these would become your new social sphere. And that cell structure that reports, up a hierarchy then leads to a national leadership. And many parallels have been drawn between that and the Muslim Brotherhood. And there's been a lot of talk about direct Muslim Brotherhood, either inspiration or liaison to create this organization. That group, the Tarbiyah movement, which is a non-political sort of grassroots movement that came from the 1980s, has since 1999 had a political manifestation in the party in Indonesia that is today called the PKS, the Partai Keadilan Sejahtera, or the Prosperous Justice Party. The PKS is very often compared and contrasted with the AKP in Turkey, although the AKP in the last decade has become a little bit different than the AKP was in the 1990s and early 2000s, when more of those comparisons were done. The PKS is the most consistent in terms of political platform of any Indonesian party today. I'm just really impressed that they're actually an ideological party, not a personality-driven party, which is hard to do in Indonesia. Most of the other parties are driven by personalities, driven by their leaders. The PKS has had its fair share of scandals. Every political party does. But the PKS is very consistent in advocating for the same kinds of issues, the same kinds of moral and religious platforms as the basis for specific legislation items that the Muslim Brotherhood has advocated for in Egypt and in other countries in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. This has really been wonderful speaking to you, and very inspiring and eye-opening and very fruitful. Uwais?
Thank you very much. There's a lot of great points that were raised in your dialogue with Dr. Sami. I had a couple of questions that came through the viewers, so let me field those to you. But before I do that, let me ask my own question. So I want to go back to Sarakat Islam, which to me was a very, when I was reading it in your book and also as you presented it, there was a couple of tensions in that movement. I mean, number one, it's very strange to see a trade union, right, as the ground for an Islamic political force, which is often seen as kind of like a leftist political strategy. And I was, it was kind of inspirational, like that there was this, that is the first beginnings of an anti-colonial Islamic political activity happens around a trade union. And if you could just talk to us about this kind of protean moment where, maybe the hardline ideological differences between socialism and Islamism or Islamic political thought were not so crystallized, and what potentialities that gives for Muslim political thought today, right? Also, it was very peculiar that this organization was targeting Chinese monopolies, given the fact that the Dutch were the colonial power. So I would have imagined that surplus extraction from Indonesia was being managed by the Dutch, but then in your writing and also elsewhere, Sarakat Islam seems to be more concerned about Chinese monopolies. So could you please explain more about why that was more important? I mean, I would have imagined that they would have been targeting, plantations or something like that, that the Dutch were extracting from Indonesia. Maybe we start there, and then I have a couple of other questions that I have noted.
Sure, always happy to talk about Sarakat Islam. It's doing a lot of really interesting things. And I've written an article specifically about the famous text by Haji Omar Said Cokroaminoto called Islam and Socialism. This was actually plagiarized from a South Asian author. And so I've written on that, sort of uncovering the plagiarism, which I don't think was previously known, and talking about how they came to understand the interaction between these. I love this question about a trade union being an unusual source for Islamic activism and Islamic politics. I'm going to tweak it a little bit because trade union is both very accurate and a little bit misleading when it comes to Sarakat Islam's origins in the Sarakat Dagang Islam. It was a trade union in exactly what those terms mean. It was a union of people doing trade, but it was not a trade union like a workers' union, right? So this was among people who were engaged in not creating the batik cloth, but in trading the batik cloth, right? Buying it off of workers and selling it. And so in that way, it's a little bit more understandable that the kind of activism that we've seen in the Iranian bazaar, to bring it back to that Iranian connection or comparison, right? The kind of activism that one sees in the bazaar among traders is often a source of political change, social change, economic change in the Muslim world. And so we can think about some of those possible parallels. In Indonesia, the Dutch were very much in control of certain sectors, and you mentioned the plantation sector, which is very true. The Dutch were very much in control of the international trade out of Indonesia, but the Chinese were, as in many other parts of Southeast Asia, as in Thailand, Malaya, parts of southern Vietnam, parts of the Philippines, the Chinese were brought in as a class of traders or capitalists who did have an intermediary role. They were not subject to the same laws as the Indonesians. They were not subject to the same laws as the Dutch. They had a separate class of laws that was for foreign Orientals that included Chinese, Arabs, Persians, Indians, Japanese for a while. Japanese were made Europeans after 1905. Those laws allowed them to engage in trade usually within Southeast Asia, so not export back to Europe, not export to the wider international market, but between Medan and Jakarta, right? Between Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan, Borneo, or Sulawesi. That level of trading made the Chinese a very visible, very local, very accessible target for Muslim activism to oppose them, because they were the guys who ran your corner seed store, right, or the seed store in your village, to which you had an accumulating debt over years of difficult drought. Those were the guys who had a monopoly on the bringing of soap into your village, or the bringing of needles, or whatever the supplies were that you needed for your industry. And so the Chinese were a very visible target because you were doing business with them on a regular basis, whereas the Dutch were less accessible, right? They were only in the government office, they were maybe in the office of the plantation, but there were a lot fewer of them and they were harder to interact with. So that's one of the reasons why the Chinese could be a target there. Sarakat Islam's roots in a trade union did have an impact on how it was understood and how popular it became. Another possible analogy in the Muslim world that we might think about and sort of prod and poke at is the role of Sarakat Islam in social welfare and supporting, not well-to-do Muslim populations in the same way as maybe the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, right? Providing collaboration, providing mutual aid. And so Sarakat Islam as a mutual aid association might be a useful way to think about why it shot up in popularity. One of the things that, as I've been reading the sources from the 19-teens, what are some of the things that drew people in to want to become members of Sarakat Islam? One was that Sarakat Islam would arrange for burials of any members who passed away to make sure they got a properly Islamic burial at the cost of Sarakat Islam, not at the cost of the family. Another was that Sarakat Islam could help you to arrange for travel on the Hajj in some branches. Sarakat Islam was broken up after 1916 or 17, but some branches were participating in arranging collective Hajj travel. And so that sort of mutual aid society might be a useful way to think about Sarakat Islam before it became so explicitly political. I know that this answer is a bit scattershot, but I hope that covers some of your curiosities.
That was really nice. That was really nice. I think Sarakat Islam is this proto-nationalist organization that is, I really find it interesting. These kind of, I don't know if pre-ideological is the right word, but these kind of proto-nationalist organization where there's a lot of the teleology hasn't gotten built in yet into where they might lead to. So they give a lot of fluid kind of potentialities. Another question I had was kind of stepping back and looking at anti-colonial Muslim activism. There has been a kind of dominant narrative by people like, Nikki Keddie and Wickham, who have kind of coded anti-colonial Islamic thought, Muslim activism along a kind of ideological trajectory that moves from Afghani, Abdu, and Rida, maybe to someone like Qutb, and then Maududi. But there have been other intellectual historians, and like Ismail Kara, for instance, in Turkey, who has advocated that Islamic political thought, especially anti-colonial or political thought, has many kind of indigenous or a variety of colors. Obviously, there's the Turkish Islamic political thought that ranges from the beginning of journals that happened under the Ottoman Empire, and then continued well into the 20th century. South Asia also, with the Pakistan movement and a lot of other Islamic organizations. It's not just Jamiatul Islam, Maududi, but a lot of other actors. I wonder if Indonesia also would have its own kind of particular Islamic. Do you think that there is a kind of Indonesian Islamic political thought tradition? And if so, who would you rank as the top kind of ideologues or thinkers from that tradition? I was very inspired by this guy named Muhammad Nasr that you mentioned in the writing of that period, especially in his analysis of kind of Kemalism and the debate around Kemalism, which as Salman Sayyid has shown is kind of like it's a kind of transnational category of people who are more skeptical about the role of Islam in politics. And unfortunately, I haven't found it. I don't know if his book is translated. I looked him up after I read your work, Capital Selecta, which is such a strange title. Capita Selecta. So maybe you can kind of lay out that just for also the students, to see if there's some, people that they could dive into, for inspiration for thinking about Islamic political thought. Yeah.
Yeah, a great question, and one that's really exciting to think on, but it's also hard. You are absolutely right that very few works have been translated out of Indonesian to make them accessible to folks who might want to read them in Arabic or in Persian or in English or in French or in Dutch. So I'll poke through some names, but I can't swear that all of their works will be accessible. You definitely mentioned Nasir, and Nasir has had many of his works compiled together. There's 3 volumes of Capita Selecta. Nasir, incidentally, he went to a Dutch colonial middle school where his major focus was in reading the classics. So he was reading Greek and Latin. And that's why he chose a Latin title for his selected works, right? Selected works in Latin is just Capita Selecta, right? So that's why it has this funny title. He was most active, or he was doing some of his most exciting thinking in the 1930s in a debate with Sukarno, who became the first president later on, in the 1940s and 50s when he was the leader of the Islamic political party Masyumi. And so that's where most of his influential writings come from. Another figure who has gotten a lot of, who has inspired a lot of, other Islamic thinkers in Indonesia, but who's gotten a lot of attention in a scholarly way, including in English, who might be useful and accessible for folks to think with, is a man called Hamka, Hamka. Now, his actual name is Haji Abdul Malik Karim Amrolla, but he's called Hamka as the abbreviation of those 5 letters, Hamka, Hamka. And there's been 2 recent biographies of Hamka in English, so students will be able to find more about him. Hamka was an activist with the organization Muhammadiyah from the 1930s up until his passing. I believe he passed away in the year 1980. And he was one of the individuals who advocated for a stronger role of Islam in the state, but he also was very much engaged in the theological debates about what Islam should be and how Islam can be modern. One of the recent biographies talks about Hamka as a cosmopolitan. I am deeply skeptical of this. I do not find Hamka to be cosmopolitan at all, but it's an interesting idea to think with, right? So I would look for Buya Hamka. I mentioned earlier Nurkhalish Majid, and his surname is spelled M-A-D-J-I-D, Majid, who famously in 1970 said, "Islam, yes, Islamic Party, no." He was one of the leading Islamic thinkers of Indonesia as it was coming up to and then after the Reformation era, right? The 1997-98 overthrow of the dictator Suharto. And Nurkhalish Majid was the key articulator of ideas of how Islam would interact with human rights in Indonesia, how Islam can play a role in inspiring political activism towards values, but not necessarily play a role in organizing the state directly. And so Nurkhalish Majid sometimes in Indonesian called Cak Nur, is a really interesting thinker. Some of his things have been translated into English, although not much. And Nurcholish Majid also was just as much of an activist as he was a writer. So some of his greatest innovations were actually what he did, not what he wrote. So those are a few names that I would think about. I mean, the other one, of course, is Chokro Aminoto, who had few writings, but those were very influential.
Thank you very much. That gives us a lot to think about, especially as we try to map out the anti-colonial Muslim nationalism as a kind of political force, like you, especially in that time period, in the decolonial period, and you really make this. I thought that was really important, was this distinction that you make in your introduction of the book, a methodological distinction between what you call grassroots, kind of Islamic imaginations, the social imaginary of grassroots Muslims, and then kind of what happens in the elite corridors of power. And in a certain sense, there is, maybe betrayal is a big word, but there is definitely a despair and a disappointment with the direction of the new Indonesian state, a post-colonial malaise of a kind. And this is something that is shared across different anti-colonial Muslim projects. So I would like for you to kind of, you've commented on it also already, but if you could kind of talk to us about what these rebellions after independence mean for that imaginary, and do you find that imaginary was defeated, or like for good reason, in the sense that politically they were outmaneuvered, not in a normative sense, but also like that's one thing. So that's one issue. And then the last question, and we're kind of running out of time, so I want to just pile these in. I really thought that, in your work, there was a distinction between the way the Japanese, I know this is kind of, maybe is not very politically correct, I don't know, but what came out from the text was that Japanese occupation of Indonesia was very different than the Dutch occupation of Indonesia, in the sense that the Japanese had a more, I mean, obviously they're an occupying power, but it seems like they kind of groomed the Indonesian anti-colonial nationalist leaders. There's a part where you talk about, like, Sukarno being kind of involved under the Japanese. You talk about how the Japanese trained these militias and regiments. You talk about them opening a kind of like a Islamic affairs bureau. So there's the Japanese interaction was quite different. And so could you talk about like how and why that may have been? I'll leave those two, and then we'll see how much time we have left over for other questions.
Great. So thank you. These are both interesting and exciting questions to think through. Why did Islam lose in the halls of power, and what was the reaction among the grassroots, right? How did that sit with them? So yes, some of them went into rebellion. Some of them just changed what they wanted, right? When you have a social imaginary that thinks in terms of a colonial power, a colonial state, or what does indigenous look like? Well, indigenous probably looks like an Islamic state. Then it makes sense that a lot of folks were oriented towards that. One of the things we've seen over the last 7 or 8 decades of Indonesian independence is, as their social imaginaries widen out, a lot of them are thinking in possibilities that are not just in terms of Islam or something else, right? They're thinking about a state that has room for Islam but isn't based on Islam. They're thinking about states that have Islam at the local level but maybe not at the national level. And we've seen some of that as territories like Aceh get special autonomy. And so there's new social imaginaries, there's new possibilities on the horizon. And that's one of the reasons why Indonesia has been successful holding together most of its territory in an incredibly diverse, very large, very populous country. Thinking about the grassroots level, it's very hard for us to get at that. And I want to recognize this as one of the great challenges of my book, I was able to interview hundreds of people, but the people that I was able to interview 50 years after the revolution were largely the people who were the youngest generation, right? So they were taking up arms, they were coming out of high school, grabbing a gun, grabbing a bamboo spear. But I have very few interviewees who were above the age of 30 when the revolution happened. I have a couple, but not that many. And so it's hard to know exactly for the full population at that time, and especially for the leaders in the village level at that time, right? The fellows who were teaching at the Islamic school, the women who were leading the Islamic prayer circle for women, we don't have a great idea of what they were doing because very few of them left behind written texts. And they were not around for me to interview, and others did not do those interviews that I found. So it's tough to know exactly what that is, the limitations of doing this kind of history. To speak briefly about how the Japanese occupation was different from the Dutch, I love how you say that the Japanese were grooming Indonesia for independence. The Japanese were grooming Indonesia for the Japanese interests. Whether that was independence or not is not clear. And the Japanese administered Indonesia in 3 different ways, right? So Java had one army, one branch of the Japanese army administering it, the 25th. Sumatra was administered by a different part of the army. The rest of Indonesia was administered by the Japanese Navy. Java got the most opportunities for Indonesian involvement in the control of the state. But in some of these other places, in Sumatra and in Eastern Indonesia, there was very little role for Indonesian people to take any decision-making during the Japanese occupation. I would also say that, in the same way that the Japanese were grooming and training troops to support their fight against Western powers, the Dutch had taken some troops of Indonesian descent into their colonial army. Largely it was Eastern Indonesians who were Christian or who were not Muslim at least. The Dutch had trained people to speak the Dutch language. The Dutch had trained people to be clerks and low level. So one could say that the Dutch were also grooming for their interests, right? I don't want to give the Japanese too much credit for looking out for Indonesian interests as they prepared these people, because I think that the Japanese were looking out for their own interests, right? They thought, how can we administer this with the fewest number of Japanese on the ground? How can we, create a para-colony or a dependency that will feed our national needs economically, politically, in terms of security and defense? And so I'm a little bit less sanguine about the Japanese, I think, than you were in the question, the way it was phrased.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that they were obviously an occupying force, and obviously, I mean, the Japanese have done a lot of what has come out as being horrific, occupying activities around Asia, but yeah, maybe even the fact that they had a kind of they had a different kind of engagement. That's what was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and if I can add on, I will say that the Japanese rhetoric in a lot of ways was very strongly contributing to Indonesian nationalism at the time. The Japanese rhetoric as they came in with the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was Asia for the Asians.
Yeah,
and that got a strong positive response.
Maybe that ideological coding gave a kind of opportunity, or that maybe the Dutch didn't really, inspire. Dutch occupation didn't inspire. Anyways, I wanted to kind of have your opinion about this category of Muslim nationalism. This idea of Islamic anti-colonial Muslim nationalism as a transnational category. I feel like since the rise of Islamism of the 80s variety, the anti-colonial Muslim nationalism, which erupted across the Muslim world, but then eventually never made it into the futures of these post-colonial states, right? Gives a kind of opening or ground for the later kind of more radical Islamic political thinking that comes about, which we kind of live in the wake of. But that Islamic anti-colonial Islamic nationalism or Muslim nationalism, I don't know which one to put it, but what resources would you, along with your book, I mean, I kind of put your book in that category of analyzing this anti-colonial Muslim nationalism. What other works would you suggest that you would place your book in conversation with on this question? And finally, what actually inspired you to do this project? And I think I will end it on that.
Thank you. Great questions. There are a number of scholars, both in Indonesia and beyond Indonesia, that are working on Muslim nationalism in Southeast Asia. I think that's where I can speak the best. You have great colleagues there in Turkey. You've got great colleagues across the Middle East who are thinking about this in other Muslim contexts. And I'm going to leave them to speak to that. But I'll talk a little bit about scholarship on Southeast Asia that might be useful as folks are developing their understanding. In terms of Western authors, I think my colleague at Cornell, Chiara Formicchi, is doing really interesting, really fascinating things with the emergence of Indonesian independence and what some Islamic visions for that were. So I'm a big fan of Chiara's work. Her first book was on Kartosuwiryo, who launched the Darul Islam rebellion in West Java, why he launched it, what his ideology was, some interesting things there. We've also got a colleague in France named Rémi Madinier, M-A-D-I-N-I-E-R, Madinier, who's written a lot about Islam in Indonesia coming into that post-colonial era, the Masyumi political party and some of the more radical elements since then. What did they envision for the Indonesian state, and how is that impacting the Muslim population more generally? In Singapore, I've got a great new colleague, Lin Hongxuan. So surname Lin, L-I-N, and then Hongxuan is H-O-N-G-X-U-A-N, who's thinking about the intersections of Islam and leftism from the nationalist era into the independence era. And that book should be coming out next month, and it's looking to be really exciting. So that's one that might be useful for folks thinking about different iterations, different lines of Muslim nationalism coming out of Southeast Asia. And then colleagues in Indonesia are doing fantastic work. My late colleague Bakhtiar Effendi, who is at the State Islamic University of Jakarta, Syarifat State Islamic University of Jakarta, has written a lot about Islam and state in Indonesia and where that intersection is. Jajet Burhanuddin, also at the State Islamic University of Jakarta, has written further back in time, right? So the early resistance and the nationalist era, sort of where are the roots of Muslim nationalism in Southeast Asia, not limited to Indonesia. I'm doing some very interesting work there. Not all of the Indonesian language scholarship has been translated into English, but there is some really good deep studies coming out.
Are Bakhtiar Effendi's work and Burhanuddin's work translated into English?
Yes, they are. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find them on my shelf just with a quick look, but yes, they have both been translated into English.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I can't say I'm going to find it on the shelf here, but both of them do have books in English.
Okay. And could you talk about your inspiration, about how
Sure.
this project came about?
I was a student 22 years ago when all of a sudden America started thinking about Islam very differently for reasons that I think everyone will understand. And I came from a very pious and active family in a Christian context. So it made perfect sense to me that religious people would have a religious understanding of what the state was about, that religious people would have a religious understanding of why they engaged in activities to determine the future of the state, to interact with other members of the state. And so I found it very natural that when I went to Indonesia for the first time to conduct research in 2005, that I should be looking for what was the religious inspiration for all of these deeply religious, deeply pious people to undertake the work that they were doing. I felt that for an understanding of the modern Indonesian state, we needed to go to that foundational era, right? When the Indonesian state was set up in the revolution, we needed to understand what Muslims thought they were going to get out of it. And that will set up why they have been struggling and have had a contested relationship with the state ever since. My dissertation, when I wrote it at Yale, was actually looking not just 45 to 49, but actually all the way to 1965, to the end of the Sukarno era. And that dissertation is publicly available. It's on my academia page if folks are interested in downloading it and reading it. But I thought that for the book, it would make a more focused, a more clear and directed argument if I just looked at the revolution itself.
Dr. Fogg, we have run out of time, but it was a great honor and a great pleasure to engage with you and your work. I think it's quite innovative in the sense that it gives us a new angle on a, and sometimes it's always an outsider that can raise questions that sometimes is very difficult for people within a kind of nationalist historiography to kind of to say it without implicating themselves in a whole bunch of other political questions. Although I'm sure that a lot of Indonesians have been an inspiration to your own work. So with that, I want to conclude, and you are more than welcome. You have an open invitation in Istanbul whenever you're here, and we would love to host you in person. So if you're ever flying through, please let us know. But before I sign off, I wanted to remind the audience that this Saturday until Monday, CIGA will be hosting the 4th International Conference on Islamophobia. Over 50 speakers will be here on campus, in person on the Halkalı campus, over 3 days. If you're in Istanbul, you're welcome to join us. If you're outside of Istanbul, we'll be live streaming the sessions on our YouTube channel. This year's Islamophobia conference is about examining the cultural and geopolitical dimensions of Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries. So looking within Muslim majority countries for growing Islamophobia. So the audience and those joining us are welcome to that this coming weekend. Again, Dr. Fogg, thanks for your gracious time, your generous contribution, insight. We hope to be in touch, and from now, signing off from Istanbul.
Thank you all so much. I apologize for any mistakes or shortcomings in my talk, and I appreciate the opportunity.